Now we consider the stability of the self over time. Put differently, we can ask the question, can the self-concept change? One way of asking that is, well, does the individual themselves change, let alone the concept of the individual? And certainly, as completely obvious, one of the most prominent changes in a human is age. The body changes dramatically over time. But not only is your body changing over time, but it is possible that the concept you have of yourself changes over time as well. So for instance, when we take children and we think of their own self-concepts, they tend to add new knowledge and skills as they grow. They start out with some rudimentary self-concept, and this concept gets modified. So we know, at least in children, that we can change the self-concept. But what about adults? Well, we certainly do things such as take up new hobbies, break bad habits, etc. And so we do things that change. Just think about coming to university. You're changing yourself just by virtue of coming to this school. And of course, if it wasn't going to change you, then you would be wasting your money coming. So clearly we go through all kinds of changes. Yet at the same time, we have to acknowledge, well, there's something that persists over time. There's some aspect of my self-concept that has to represent the fact that I, Chad Woodruff, am, at the age of 51, am the same Chad Woodruff on some level that I was at the age of 5. There is some self that has made it from 5 years of age to 51 years of age. So this can be talked about in multiple ways, and it's really hard to change the fact that I was that 5-year-old kid. On the other hand, in a different conversation, I might say something like, "Oh, I'm not at all the same person I was when I was a child," and we would understand what I mean by that. We would understand that I mean that even though my body's very different and my attitudes might be very different, my beliefs, etc., that at the same time, I'm still going by the same name, I have the same parents, I was born in the same town as that little guy, 50, or what would they be, 46 years ago. So, yes, the self-concept can change, even though some aspect of it would need to be kind of stationary and not really moving, not changing over time. So it is possible to revise self-knowledge. And this is the question of, can it change how you think of yourself or change your behavior? Okay, and a change in self-concept will follow. So this can work two kind of ways. I kind of have a little quote of my own that I think it's at the bottom of my emails. Let's see if I can conjure it up. It's something to the effect of, not only do I do what I do because I am who I am, but I am who I am because I do what I do. I'll go ahead and say that again. Not only do I do what I do because I am who I am who I am because I do what I do. So yes, you can say there are things that you, as somebody that knows me well, can predict my behavior in certain situations. And that would suggest that the things I do in those situations are because of the person that I am. At the same time, I do revise my own self-knowledge over time. And I do that by observing my own behavior. I think I mentioned in a previous slide the idea of helping an old lady across the street versus tripping an old lady walking across the street. Those two actions, those two behaviors have very different implications for the kind of person I am. And maybe I used to help old ladies across the street, but as I'm getting old and grumpy, and now I'm just knocking them over as I make my way across campus. I revise my self-concept by virtue of observing the things I do. So again, the first one is, I'd like to say I help old ladies across the street because I am a nice person. So I do the things I do because I am the person I am. But it's also the case that I have to observe my behavior over time to see if it changes. If indeed I observe myself tripping old ladies across the street, then I need to observe what I do in order to figure out who I am. I am no longer a nice person. And I know this because I observe my behavior. So the cause can flow in different directions. The who you are can cause what you do, but what you do can cause who you are. So if changing the self-concept over time is possible, then as far as the self-concept and self-perception models we've looked at, how can we use one of those to explain how the change may occur? What's the mechanism of change? So your textbook authors choose to go with the looking glass theory of self-awareness. And so if we think of Joe's self-concept, okay, then Joe's self-concept will change little if his social circle does not change. So if Joe, let's just say Joe's in a small town, he grew up there, and let's say that he decides to stay there, live and work in this small town and spend his life there, well, his social circle will change very little over that time. Therefore, his self-concept will change very little. It's that tight coupling between sociality and self. Can't really seem to have one without the other. So if Joe goes off to college, however, he's likely to make many revisions to his self-concept. The new circles of individuals he interacts with, from friends to classmates to professors to teammates, etc. All of these new social circles he's going to partake in are going to cause him to learn new things about himself. And this learning of new things, looking through the mirror of how other people are responding to him, he will update his self-concept, thereby revising it. And indeed, if for whatever reason you want to change, then the best way to promote that change is to enlist the support of other people. So if Joe is looking for a change, then going from his small town to college is almost guaranteed to be a very large change for him, and therefore is very likely to change a lot about his self-concept. So you want change, then change your environment, particularly your social environment. Take, for instance, alcoholism. As we all know, someone struggling with alcoholism is well advised to change their social circles. Stop hanging out with that. If they're trying to quit, of course. Stop hanging out with the people who you have traditionally drank with, and find a new circle of people to socialize with, ones that are not drinking. Of course, that's no guarantee that that Joe will stop drinking, but it definitely is going to increase his chances. And at this point, then, we can ask the question, all right, so the self can change. The looking glass self might be one theory that explains the mechanism for change. You change the mirrors that you're reflecting off of, and you change yourself. We've talked about the way to promote that change is to change the environment. Well, what about your memories for the way you have behaved in the past, or the experiences you've had? We tend to revise our memories of ourselves in the past in order to be consistent with our new self-concept. When our self-concept has changed, we tend to revise our stories, our memories about the person we are. There's a study that mentions a study with women going through menstrual periods. This is discussed in the book, and there they note that each woman's belief was about her general reactions was biased in her recall. So if a woman thought her periods were particularly bad, then she tended to recall having periods that were worse than what she had originally said they were. So she says how bad they are at the time, and then a month later she's asked to recall how bad they were. If she said they were bad at the time, then she rated them as even worse in her memory. And conversely, if she rated them at the time as relatively mild, then her memory of them would actually be exceptionally mild. So your original beliefs about the experience can be revised, can change the actual memory that you have. One aspect of our self-concept is self-esteem. And as we all know, more or less, this is how favorably someone evaluates himself or herself or themselves. Self-esteem, how highly do you evaluate yourself? People with high self-esteem generally are competent, likable, attractive, and morally good. Okay, or at least they certainly see themselves that way. It's actually the way I should point that out. And high self-esteem, that obviously viewing yourself as competent, likable, attractive, and morally good is pleasant, right? It's rewarding. We would like to believe those things about ourselves, and so we would naturally assume that high self-esteem is good and low self-esteem is bad. But as in so many things in psychology, it's not that simple. High self-esteem is certainly good in many respects. It's good to believe that you're competent and likable, etc. However, high self-esteem can be taken to an extreme, and in fact, we see over here to the right, we see a book by Jean Twenge and Keith Campbell, a book called The Narcissism Epidemic. And this book is a follow-up to a previous book by Jean Twenge that's discussing the issue of self-esteem and the fact that for a couple of generations or so now, American society has been focused on boosting self-esteem. So particularly as we educate our children and we raise them in our families, we really work on promoting their self-esteem. Because again, it seems good to feel like you're competent, likable, attractive, and morally good. On the other hand, it seems to have gotten us to a point to where everyone gets a trophy, that everyone is believing that they're all equally valuable on some particular task or goal, or what have you. And Twenge and Campbell's idea is that by pumping our children's self-esteem up so high, we may be causing some of them to become narcissistic, maybe many of them to become narcissistic. And so she really questions whether just inflating one's self-esteem is a good idea. I think she would argue that, and she being Jean Twenge, I think she would argue that there are some benefits to having high self-esteem, but that the way we raise our children should not be so focused on inflating that self-esteem. Well, what about folks with low self-esteem? Their perceptions of themselves aren't exactly opposite of those with high self-esteem. So instead of somebody with low self-esteem saying, I'm competent, ugly, unlikable, and morally wicked, no, instead, what I'm saying tend to be things like, well, I'm not so good at that, or I'm not the most attractive person, I'm perhaps less likable than some people, and, I'm kind of immoral sometimes. So none of us really seem to go into such a low self-esteem that we think we are incompetent, ugly, unlikable, and morally wicked. We tend to soften the negative side of that stuff for ourselves. And something we see in people with low self-esteem is that they'll tend to have self-concept confusion. So for instance, when asked about themselves, they're more likely to say that they're unsure about themselves, who they are. They're more likely to give contradictory answers to who they are, and they're more likely to describe themselves differently on different days. So inconsistent. their beliefs about themselves change over time. So there's this kind of self-concept confusion. People with low self-esteem tend to engage more in self-protection. And self-protection is a means of avoiding loss of esteem. So maybe you argue with somebody that that you did better on some task than they think you did anyway. And instead of just trying to improve your score or accepting what the score was, maybe you argue that it's a good score, even if the other person says it's a bad score. And self-protection is a motive used by people with low self-esteem typically instead of that self-enhancement motive. So rather than focusing on time looking for information that flatters the person with low self-esteem, they instead tend to look for information that helps them protect or not lose the esteem that they have. And apparently people with low self-esteem are prone to mood swings and emotional overreactions. We've discussed high versus low self-esteem. That is, people who have generally positive views of themselves versus people who have less positive views of themselves. High self-esteem versus low self-esteem. Now, let's consider who's more accurate. Well, you might expect that depressed people are less accurate in their perceptions of the world around them, in their perception of their own selves, about their own abilities, their own likability, their own various characteristics and traits. Maybe that's why they're depressed, is because they negatively underestimate or are overly critical of themselves. Well, the research seems to suggest quite the opposite, that, well, not the opposite, but otherwise. That is, depressed people seem to be quite realistic about their abilities, about how likable they are, about their performance on various tasks. Interestingly enough, it's the non-depressed people, the happy people, that are actually deceiving themselves. People that have high self-esteem, people that are not depressed, these people overestimate their good qualities. They overestimate the amount of control they have over the events that happen around them, and they're kind of unrealistically optimistic. Now, notice we're not necessarily saying that it's a bad thing that non-depressed people are deceiving themselves. This may well have evolved as an evolutionary, survivable adaptability, that being able to pump one's self-esteem up. Again, you got to be careful with this, because you could pump yourself esteem up to a point to where narcissism perhaps sets in. But to the extent that overestimating your good qualities, overestimating your control over the world around you, and being unrealistically optimistic may help actually create that positive, that higher self-esteem. And so it may be good that we're deceiving ourselves, but it is rather interesting. And it's kind of a negative view on it. Well, it turns out the world really is just crap. And happy people are the ones that are fooling themselves about that. So how do these clever, non-depressed, normal people, as your textbook calls them, how do they fool themselves? Well, by using self-deception strategies. And these are mental tricks for believing things that are false. They, again, as we mentioned, they tend to be more optimistic. Well, optimistic implies that your view of the future is falsely positive, more positive than it actually is. Okay, so by being optimistic in that sense, you're tricking yourself into believing something that is not true. Self-deception. And of course, this diminishes the impact of failures or other forms of negative feedback that one is likely to receive. So one of the ways we do this self-deception is by using the self-serving bias. We claim credit for success, but deny blame for failure. Remember, we discussed self-handicapping, getting drunk before a test, for instance, so that if you perform poorly on the test, you can say that it's because you're drunk. If you perform well on the test, you can say, wow, despite the fact that I was drunk, I must be pretty smart because I still did well on the test. So these self-serving biases again, our way of taking credit for the successful accomplishments you've made, but discounting your blame for anything that doesn't go quite right. People fool themselves, again, normal people fool themselves by being skeptical of bad feedback. I tend to wonder how this works because I often hear it claimed that it takes 7 positive comments to counteract 1 negative comment. However, based on what your book is claiming, that would not necessarily be true. That we tend to pay more attention to positive feedback, and that we're skeptical or tend to disbelieve the negative feedback. So I'm not sure whether that more anecdotal kind of common sense thing of where negative comments affect us more than positive ones is that correct, or is it, at least for these quote unquote normal people, that that instead they tend to be skeptical of the negative feedback and listen instead to the positive comments? Now, obviously, one reason for doing this would be that focusing on good things can counteract the power of the bad things. Again, it's just a question of how many people do that versus how many people actually tend to focus on the negative. Another way of self-deceiving, is downward social comparison that we mentioned previously. This idea of saying, well, at least I'm not as bad off as he is, or at least I'm not as sick as she is, or at least I'm a faster runner than he is, et cetera, et cetera. Another way to fool oneself is to skew one's impressions of other people and to highlight one's own good traits. So I might tend to think of other people's accomplishments as nothing that spectacular, whereas I believe my own to be quite unusual and meritorious. And the authors of your book also note that one should choose definitions wisely. That is, what does it mean to be good at something, to be a good athlete, or to be a good musician, or a good artist, or a good accountant, or what have you. Because one way we fool ourselves sometimes is by defining being good at something in a very narrow way so that we fit that definition. So what are the benefits of high self-esteem? Well, perhaps surprisingly, not many benefits. For one thing, it seems that high self-esteem is basically just the false belief that you're superior. That is, people with high self-esteem tend to believe they get higher grades, that they're better at their sports, that they're more likable people. But in reality, they're not getting higher grades. They're not more likable than people with low self-esteem, etc. So they don't seem to be giving the kind of benefits that you necessarily would expect. There are 2 particular areas, however, where people with high self-esteem do seem to benefit. They tend to be more or take more initiative, and they're somewhat better at jumping on a task and getting it done. And the other benefit is that they feel good about it. Having high self-esteem tends to be rewarding, tends to feel good. So if self-esteem, particularly high self-esteem, doesn't really afford many benefits, then why do we care about self-esteem? Well, the sociometer theory suggests that we care because self-esteem is a measure of how desirable we are in the eyes of other people. How socially accepted are we? High self-esteem is correlated with high social acceptance. Therefore, the reason we care about self-esteem may simply be because self-esteem indicates to us that we're doing well in terms of being socially accepted. Another theory focuses on terror management, the idea that at our core we all fear death. And one reason high self-esteem might be desirable to us is because it helps us avoid thinking about death. that feeling good about oneself tends to diminish the fear that one has of death ultimately. In a previous slide, we discussed Jean Twenge and her belief that high self-esteem is leading to narcissism. And in fact, high self-esteem and narcissism are related to each other, although they're not the same thing. It's entirely possible to have high self-esteem but not be narcissistic. On the other hand, most narcissists do have high self-esteem. So what is narcissism? It's excessive self-love and a selfish orientation. Again, not the same thing as high self-esteem, but rather related. Now, people that are high in self-esteem, not just narcissists, but high in self-esteem generally, these people tend to be a bit more prejudiced. Their high self-esteem tends to lead them to believe that their in-group is better than other out-groups. So if the in-group is racial, then if you are high in self-esteem, then you're more likely to believe that your race is superior to others, and therefore more likely to discriminate. Narcissistic people in particular make poor relationship partners. They tend to think of a relationship as what's in it for me. They have a harder time thinking about their partner and what their partner needs. Narcissism can lead to antisocial actions, and in general, high self-esteem can lead to persistence in the face of failures. So we mentioned previously that one of the benefits of self-esteem, high self-esteem, is initiative. These people tend to really go at their goals, and that's great when your goal is achievable. But what if the goal is simply not achievable? Then persistence can be a bad thing there. You might continue to try and achieve a goal that you just won't be able to achieve. So there may be a couple of benefits to high self-esteem, but there are also some downsides. So what are some of the consequences of pursuing self-esteem? Well, it appears they're mostly harmful consequences. One thing is people that are trying to enhance their self-esteem may tend to take the easy road to ensure success. They may choose challenges that are easier so they can make sure that they succeed at those challenges rather than looking for more meaningful, even if they may be more difficult challenges. Seeking self-esteem can impair autonomy. Autonomy being this idea that you do what you want to do in the world as opposed to perhaps what others want you to do. On the other hand, if self-esteem is all about gaining social acceptance, then one's autonomy is reduced when they're seeking self-esteem, because rather than operating on their own beliefs and desires, they're looking to others for acceptance. They're changing their behavior in order to increase their self-esteem, not for their own reasoning. And people in this situation tend to feel like they need to meet the expectations of others. It can also weaken individual intrinsic motivation. That is, people pursuing self-esteem are going to focus more on extrinsic motivation, the extrinsic motivation being the reward they get from acceptance by others. And as we talked about earlier, intrinsic motivation generally leads to better performance than extrinsic motivation. Pursuing self-esteem can impair learning because we're less likely to take criticism from others, to take useful feedback to improve our skills. Instead, we tend to discount, if we're pursuing self-esteem, we'll discount negative feedback from others, which denies us an opportunity to learn from our mistakes. It can be damaging to relationships because it may cause competition with your partner. And in fact, if you're pursuing self-esteem and your partner is more successful than you, then it can actually cause resentment toward that partner. And ultimately, pursuing self-esteem can be a rather stressful event, and we all know that stress can lead to to unhealthiness, can lead to damage to even to tissue, body tissue, let alone to the heart, so forth.